3 weeks before the wedding, when my life felt like a carefully folded map ready to be opened, my phone rang. It was my father, the man whose shadow had always felt like a promise at my side. He spoke in a voice I recognized down to its inflection, and for a moment I let myself believe it would be the same conversation we'd had 1,000 times. Reassurance, a joke, a blessing. Instead he said plainly, "I won't walk you down the aisle." The words landed like a stone in a quiet pond. The sound was smaller than I'd feared and louder than anything I'd ever heard from him. "I disagree with your choices," he told me, as if that explained everything. To stand there would be hypocrisy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I heard the click of the line like a finality slamming a door. I stared at the phone until the screen went dark and the ordinary kitchen light felt suddenly too bright. For a moment I tried to rationalize it. Pride, stubbornness, a man set in his ways. I told myself he was angry in the heat of the moment. That age will harden people. That blood will tend toward old habits. I wanted to believe those excuses because to believe anything else was to admit something worse. That the person who had defined the contour of my life could choose to erase his presence from one of its most important hours. The next curve in that hurt happened faster than I expected. At a family dinner in Williamsburg, a table that had always been a refuge of laughter and lasagna, he confirmed it in front of everyone. It started as a murmur, then a sentence, then the truth laid out like a scarlet ribbon on the table. Attempts at explanation only deepened the silence. My cousins looked away. My mother's hand caught mine and went limp. Forks paused mid-air. The room tilted. I felt small, invisible, humiliated in a way that seemed to live in my bones. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else offered a clumsy excuse for him. Judgments gathered in the quiet like rain clouds. I almost let that silence become the story. I imagined calling the whole thing off, retreating into the safety of shame. But as I left the restaurant into the cold Williamsburg night, a different kind of clarity arrived, sharp, steady, and I made a choice. I would answer his refusal, but not with matching bitterness. I would not let him write my shame. What I did next would require more than stubbornness. It would force me to create a new path where none seemed possible. The first step was ugly and honest, admitting I could be wounded and still decide to rise. The first night after the dinner I replayed the exchange until it turned into a film I could not edit. The restaurant's yellow light, the scrape of silverware, my father's voice folding into the clink of glasses. "I will not walk you down the aisle." As if he had pronounced a sentence rather than refused a honor he had promised for decades. Around us faces blurred into verdicts. My aunt's eyes pinched, my cousin's fork froze midair. Silence wasn't comfort. It was an accusation that pressed my ribs flat. I left before the check, walking the Williamsburg blocks with cold air like punctuation, every breath spelling humiliation. At home I sat on the edge of my bed and did something I had not imagined. I catalogued the shame. Names, dates, the small betrayals. Then in the quiet arithmetic of anger, a different ledger opened, one of numbers and receipts I had been too modest to count. I dug through shoeboxes and an old email folder and found wire transfers, signed consent forms, tuition payment confirmations I'd made in secret for nieces and nephews, a mortgage transferred once to keep the house afloat when my uncle's job failed. There were tax forms, quiet donations to causes my family praised as theirs. Each document was a small miracle and a quiet testimony. I had been propping up the narrative of this family without an audience. The knowledge did not feel like vanity. It felt like ammunition. I could imagine the scene again, only now I saw different angles. If they had the power to declare my moment a disgrace, I had the power to fund a different one. I called Anna, the cousin who had hugged me in the driveway and whose voice had cracked that night. "We won't let him take this," she said, and the certainty in her tone made strategy possible. We sat in a diner at dawn, the window fogged with breath, and sketched what honor might look like when you paid for it yourself. A chapel that would be mine, a procession that would name my choices as courage, not scandal. There was fear, yes, fear of retaliation, of being seen as spiteful, but under it a fierce relief. The ledger on my lap had shifted more than dollars. It had moved expectation. I closed it, palm steady, and for the first time I felt like I could purchase not revenge but reclamation. The next step was raw and public, to remake the ceremony into evidence that my life had never needed his permission. The restaurant's candles burned low when he spoke the words that broke the room. "I won't walk you down the aisle." His voice was steady, as if pronouncing a verdict. Around the long table, forks paused in midair, the hum of conversation folding into an awkward silence that felt like a curtain coming down. I remember the way my napkin trembled in my hands, how my name tasted strange. My father's eyes were sharp and cold. My cousin laughed too loudly to fill the space. My mother stared at her plate as if it could swallow the moment whole. Humiliation had a color, the sickly yellow of the lamp over our heads, and a sound, a small repeated click like a clock insisting on the passage of something I was about to lose. After everyone left, I stayed. The city outside Williamsburg moved on, trucks backing up, a saxophone from the corner, and inside I sat with the ruin of a dream. For a second I wanted to call it off. The image of an empty seat next to me was a weight I could not bear. But when I closed my eyes, another memory rose. Years of quiet labor, checks mailed, late-night calls to fix what needed fixing, the accounts I had quietly balanced so others could live without counting. There was a private ledger in my head, entries of all the ways I had kept things afloat. I had been invisible even in my own generosity. My partner found me on the stoop, eyes rimmed with the same exhausted anger. "Cancel nothing," they said, and their certainty steadied me. "If he wants to take your story, write a better one." That was when the fight inside me shifted from hurt to strategy. I started making lists, not of grudges but of what I actually had. Savings, a small property in Brooklyn, friends who owed me nothing but offered everything, an aunt who'd always sent flowers and never asked for thanks. I called the woman who had been my mentor. She answered the phone like a bell and offered a venue, musicians, a minister who would speak truth. My cousin who had laughed too loud the night of the dinner replied to my message with a single sentence. "I'll stand with you." As plans grew, so did a revelation I had never meant to expose. The family that thought me dependent had been living on my care for years. I could see with a clarity that was almost cruel how the ledger of my life countered their assumptions. Power, I discovered, was not only about who shows up but who pays the freight. I did not want vengeance, I wanted dignity. I reimagined the procession as a declaration, not of money, but of independence hard-won. I booked the church. I rehearsed the walk. I made a list of names to read aloud that would shift the shape of that afternoon. And yet, even as I arranged flowers and chairs, there was one part of the plan I kept folded in my pocket, a truth I would not speak until the right moment, a truth that would reframe everything they thought they knew about who had been supporting whom. The next step was to make them listen. I started at the kitchen table with a notebook and a trembling pen, like some conspirator plotting a rescue. The humiliation from Williamsburg still clung to my clothes, but the anger had a shape now, a list of what I could do, who I could call, and how I would refuse to be shrunken by someone else's verdict. I made phone calls in the small hours, a cousin who owned a gallery, an old boss who had once said I was tougher than I looked, a college friend now an events director. Each yes sounded like a brick laid back into my chest. "You don't understand," Aunt Lucia said over coffee in her sunlit living room, hands folded over a china cup. "You've always been the quiet one, but you've been building a life no one knew about." She reached into her purse and handed me an envelope. Inside were checks, notes, and a folded email printout from a benefactor who wanted to sponsor community events. "Use it," she said simply. "Turn their whisper into your speech." A conversation with Mara, my wedding planner, shifted the plan from defensive to theatrical. We traded ideas in a cluttered studio filled with fabric swatches and sketches. "We'll make the aisle a statement," she said, sketching a procession where my entrance wasn't escorted but celebrated. "Music, faces you choose, a spotlight on who you are." I could see it. Not an absence but a procession of people who mattered, colleagues, neighbors, the woman from my book club, the young architect I'd mentored. Each person would be a stitch in a new tapestry. I found resources in surprising places. My small consultancy, the late nights, the clients who became friends, produced a fund I had never announced. Their messages of support arrived as wire confirmations that felt like confessions. We believe in you. Count on us. The allies were not just financial. They were witness, memory, and humor. Jorge from the deli volunteered his son's car for a vintage entrance. My sister texted a voice memo that started with a laugh and ended with, "You'll walk alone if you must, but we'll be 1,000 behind you." There was a moment, resting my forehead on the cool glass of my apartment window, when I realized the hidden rule I'd uncovered. Power shifts when you stop begging for permission to exist. I began to draft the vows, the procession list, the program, not as a reaction but as an act of architecture. If he wanted to make me small at a family table, I would build a cathedral of belonging. The phone buzzed with one more message that night. An invitation I hadn't expected and a revelation that would tilt everything. The night after the Williamsburg dinner, I couldn't sleep. The apartment hummed with the city, but inside me was a cold room where every plate clinked like a verdict. My phone had been hot with messages, some pitiful, some furious, most stunned, and my father's voice replayed in my head. It would be hypocrisy for him to walk me down the aisle. Hypocrisy. The word landed like a stone. By morning I stopped trying to shrink from it. I took the call I had been avoiding for years, the one where I counted what I had quietly built while trying to earn his approval. There were spreadsheets, brokerage accounts tucked away under an old password. A small rental that had finally paid off. Nothing flashy, no one-line miracle, but enough. Enough to stop pretending I needed him to make this day real. I met with Nora, the planner who smelled of espresso and old invitations, in a sunlit studio above a florist on Atlantic Avenue. She listened without pity. "You want this to be yours," she said, and the way she said it made the possibility look like architecture. We drew a different map. A procession that began outside the church, not as an absence but as a parade. My mentors, my friends, the people who had carried me when my father would not. We discussed lighting that would make the brownstone facades glow. A string quartet that would not sound like consolation but like proclamation. Phone calls multiplied into allies. My sister, who had been silent that night, showed up with an envelope and a look that was almost shameful for the apology she couldn't fully voice. She offered money, yes, but more importantly she offered to stand at the front with me if I wanted. Marcus, my partner, negotiated with the church and calmed my tidal anger into logistics. Mrs. DeLuca from my block, the woman who had given me a job when I needed one, volunteered to usher guests, as though kindness could be enlisted as a battalion. There were hard choices. Invite my father, speak to him publicly, or let the silence speak for itself. Each decision felt like stepping onto a plank over a canyon. But with every call I made and every check I signed with hands that had trembled once, the shape of the ceremony grew larger than his refusal. I was buying more than vendors. I was buying a stage where my dignity would be the headline. When the invitations went out, the energy shifted. The family saw pages and dates and confirmations, and whispers spread, not of shame but of curiosity. I had turned their attempt to diminish me into a budget, a plan, a mobilized people. The moment of truth was still weeks away, but already the power had begun to tilt. There was one last thing to decide before the doors opened, and it would change everything. I remember the first night I stopped answering the hollow ache with excuses and started naming it. Humiliation. It sat in my ribs like cold iron. I sank onto the couch, the Williamsburg plate still warm on the table, and made a list, not of who had betrayed me, but of what I actually had. A ledger of small victories. A business that finally turned the corner, months of frugal saving, a retirement account my mother had always insisted I squander on experience. A line of clients who trusted me without question. I had been walking around like a pauper because it was easier than letting my father believe I could own my life. So I called people. Not the ones who would tell me to forgive and forget, but the ones who would build. Mara, my college friend who now ran a boutique event company, answered on the second ring. "You don't cancel the thing they tried to take," she said, voice blunt as a hammer. "You make it impossible for them to pretend they can." That bluntness felt like wind on my face. I told her the date, the church, the seating chart that suddenly felt like a battlefield. We worked in secrecy, late-night calls, contracts signed over cups of coffee at diners, a spreadsheet of vendors paid in cash transfers I scheduled during lunch breaks. When I called the florist, I felt my palms tremble. When I entered the card number, every digit was a small act of defiance. I saw the economy of my life rearrange itself. What I had once hidden as prudence was now armor. I paid for the venue, hired the efficient people in our circles admired, and arranged for a friend, an old client with a booming voice and a willingness to be visible, to read a testament to choices made outside a father's approval. There were harder moments. My sister texted, "Is this really necessary?" And I typed back, "Yes," before I could talk myself out of it. The old shame tried to sneak back in during the fitting when the seamstress pinned the gown into something that made me stand straighter than I'd felt in years. Pride, when earned, is a different animal from pride used as a shield. Mine felt steady, not brittle. On the morning I signed the final invoices, the city outside my window was waking up. Delivery trucks, an early church bell, the smell of bread from the corner bakery. I felt something else waking too, a quiet readiness. If he'd wanted a spectacle, he would have one of his own making, I thought. But I would decide the terms. We had created a swelling of support that would not be denied, and now I had to practice walking into it. The dress hung by the window, the sun cutting a bright path across the floor. I breathed in, and the next step was already there, waiting. The reception was a low hum of silverware and laughter, sunlight sliding across the tablecloths like a promise I almost didn't take. My body still buzzed from the walk, each step a stitch in the new skin I had chosen. Then a quiet grew, the sort of hush that happens when someone in a room realizes something huge is about to be said. I felt it like electricity. I hadn't planned a spectacle, but neither would I let the last week's humiliation be the final act of my story. I took the microphone with hands that didn't tremble as much as my chest did. Faces turned. Cousins who had watched me grow. My sister whose eyes had watermarks from too many family dramas. My father, folded in his chair like a man with too many contrived convictions. For a moment I remembered the first call, the cold cadence of his refusal, and I fed that memory into a steadier voice. "You remember the story he tells," I began, and the room leaned in. "The one about who built this family, who held the line." My father lifted his chin. I felt the old hierarchy like glass shards underfoot. "The truth isn't the one he rehearses." I told them then, in the open air of lamps and clinking glasses, what he'd been telling himself to keep control. That I needed him, that his absence would hurt more than his presence. I watched his face crack as I spoke the other truth, the one I'd kept secret because it wasn't for his applause. For years, while he preached and placed himself on a pedestal, I had been the quiet lender, the emergency night call, the one who had paid mortgages, covered medical bills, and sent tuition checks. I had saved the family home from a lien. I had been, in his absence, the family's backstop. Silence pooled. Then a cousin whispered, "You did all that?" My sister squeezed my hand. My father turned the color of old paper. It was a small, terrible thing to see the man who had pronounced my choices immoral realize he had been morally indebted to the person he scorned. "You could have asked," he said finally, voice ragged, as if the words themselves were unfamiliar to him. "You could have shown up," I replied, and there was no triumph in it, only a long, honest catalogue of hurt. I offered no spectacle of revenge. I offered boundary. Help had been given but never bought back control. The room exhaled. Some faces softened, some hardened. The evening had shifted, not because I had taken his power, but because I had named mine. He swallowed. The next thing he did would decide whether this was an ending, or the opening scene of something larger between us. I remember the exact clink of the coffee cup when I decided I would not let him write my shame. It was a Tuesday morning in a sunlit Brooklyn cafe, steam fogging the window, and my friend Mara slid a legal pad and a look across the table like she was offering me armor. "Then we build it bigger," she said, as if it were the simplest plan in the world. It wasn't simple, but it felt like a map out of the dark. The next weeks were a montage of rehearsal halls, florist warehouses, and late-night calls. I signed contracts with hands that trembled but did not falter. The church and its honeyed wood pews, a chorus that promised to fill the nave with voices so clear they'd leave no room for whispering shame. A small production team to stream the ceremony for anyone who needed to watch from afar. I learned the strange currency of power, how a deposit can buy dignity if you spend it on truth, on ceremony, on people chosen because they had held you when your own blood had not. Allies arrived in odd configurations. My sister Olivia, who had always been quiet at family dinners, offered to read the poem I had never had the courage to say aloud. A former client, now a friend, insisted on underwriting travel for a handful of relatives he knew would hesitate to come. Even my neighbor, a retired carpenter, offered to build a wooden arch from scrapped floorboards so the vows would stand on reclaimed strength. "Your life," he said when I protested, "isn't a thing to be pawned for their comfort." There were small resistances, emails from my father that would not leave me, his voice a needle I kept pulling from the fabric of my days, but they were outnumbered. Each commitment felt like a stitch in a new story. A procession not defined by absence, but by who I invited to witness my choice. I practiced the walk at night, the church emptied, moonlight through stained glass painting me in color. My heels sounded an even, deliberate rhythm on the stone. On the last night before the invitations were mailed, standing in that echoing space, I realized I'd done more than plan a ceremony. I had inverted the ledger that had long balanced in his favor. Where once his approval bought me visibility, now my resources were making visible the life I had built without it. The choir tuner struck a note, the organ inhaled, and I felt a river of something fierce and calm roll through me, as if the world were holding its breath for the moment I finally stepped forward. The dinner was supposed to be small, the kind of uneasy, polite thing families do to pretend a line can be erased with pasta and tiramisu. It was late summer. String lights cut the Williamsburg dusk into squares, cicadas humming like a distant orchestra. He sat at the head of the long table as if nothing had happened, a fortress of folded hands and old certainty. Around him, cousins and aunts who had watched me shrink the night he announced his absence at my wedding kept their eyes like shutters, waiting to see how my confession would bend. I had rehearsed lines I would never use. I had practiced anger that would only feed their appetite. Instead, I reached under my chair and pulled out something colder and quieter than words, a thin folder with stapled deeds and a corporate stamp. The air tightened. I could hear my mother's breath catch as if she suddenly remembered me as a child trying to climb a wall and falling. "You didn't have to walk me down the aisle to be seen," I said. My voice did not waver. "You chose to make me invisible. Tonight I'm making something visible." He laughed, the sound small and brittle. "What is this, a stunt?" "No," I set the papers on the table and slid them toward him. "I bought the building on Bedford. The restaurant, the backyard where you declared my shame. It belongs to me now. I bought it last month. I've been paying the mortgage on the house you think you own. I've been the silent guarantor on the loans that kept our family business afloat. I didn't tell you because you would have seen it as charity or leverage. I didn't tell you because I wanted to know whether you would ever choose me without the ledger." Silence opened like a wound. Faces shifted between admiration and confusion. Some of them reached for their phones for the certainty of a caption. His color drained. I saw the control in his eyes, the comfortable cruelty, dissolve like paper left in rain. He tried to speak, a protest, an old authority, and the words flailed. "This is not revenge," I continued. "It's a boundary. I will fund Mama's care, I will fund the repairs, but I will not fund your judgment. You will not dictate who gets to be honored in this family." It was not triumph as I had imagined it in lonely midnight fantasies. It was more complicated. A reclamation that tasted both sweet and strange. People leaned forward, some smiling, some appalled, but every head was turned. He stood, abruptly small, and left through the kitchen door without looking back. When the clatter of his departure faded and the murmurs began to reshape around me, I felt the shift. A new ledger, a new power. But the victory was raw. Beneath it nest some truths that had not yet been spoken, debts of guilt and absence that paper could not settle. I knew then that unmaking his authority would not erase the reasons he withheld it. It would only begin a different fight. The reception smelled of lemon cake and borrowed linens. Laughter ricocheting off exposed brick like a promise I had to decide whether to keep. I had rehearsed silence as a weapon, practiced the polite nod that would let the night slide back into ordinary. Instead, I found my feet carrying me to the small stage where a spotlight, someone had insisted on one, caught the dust in the air and my own reflection in a dozen eyes. I promised myself one thing, I said, before the words could be sanded into something softer. My voice was steadier than I felt. That if anyone tried to write my shame for me, I wouldn't give them the pen. My father's face, familiar as the ridge of a well-worn map, tightened. He sat at the head table, hands folded like a man rehearsing a prayer he'd never meant to keep. Around him cousins exchanged looks, a sister's mouth parted, and the new in-laws shifted their weight like people who'd brought gifts to a contest and suddenly realized the rules had changed. You left us. He said it like a verdict. You left our world. You left room for me to find my own. I answered because neither of us had the patience for anything else. Then I did the thing I had carried in my coat pocket for months. An envelope thick enough to suggest more than a note. I didn't throw it on the table like a gauntlet. I set it there, measured, visible. I have been quiet about a lot, I told them. I paid the mortgage when it started slipping. I covered the medical bills you thought were on the charity list. I kept the doors open at the shop so your name would still be there. I did it because I loved you, not because you earned it. A collective intake of breath, astonishment, anger, something like recognition, moved through the room. My father's jaw worked. You can't, he began. Watch me, I said, and for the first time that week the words weren't for him. They were for myself. I could have used what I've kept as leverage. I could have made you small. But I don't want revenge. I want dignity. I want my life honored, not bargained with. Murmurs rose. A cousin stood, voice thin with surprise. All this time, a younger niece who had never seen me as anything but the quiet one, reached for my hand and squeezed. He stood then, and his shadow stretched long across the parquet. The look on his face had the edges of panic and the memory of a man who had always believed money and love were his to distribute. This isn't over, he said, low and dangerous, as if those 3 words were an incantation against the life I'd claimed. It was the first real threat of the night, and it landed like a bell. I felt the room tilt, the future taking a new slope. I had rewritten one scene, but the story was not finished. He had other moves, and I had to decide whether to answer with fire or with the steadiness I'd built in the quiet years. The reception hummed like a second heart, laughter rattling off exposed brick, the scent of lemon tarts and coffee, cousins clustering like small islands of opinion. He sat where he always sat in family stories. At the head, chin up, waiting for the moment to reclaim the narrative. When the room softened and the music dipped, I took the microphone. I should have asked the church organist for a drum roll, I said, and the laugh that followed felt brittle. My pulse thrummed under silk. 3 weeks ago my father told me he wouldn't walk me down the aisle. He said attending would be hypocrisy. His face tightened. I saw in his eyes the old habit, the expectation that my apology would be the punctuation mark of the evening. Instead I held up the envelope. Simple manila, a deed inside. The air altered, as if someone had turned down the warmth and raised the light. I didn't cancel. I found people who believed in me. I found resources. I found it in myself to keep our home because someone had to. I let the silence fill the space between the chandeliers. That brownstone on Willow? The one Dad bragged about as if it were a prize he had earned? I bought it last spring. A murmur, then a cough, then the clink of a fork dropped. He swallowed, the familiar authority wavering. I didn't buy it to punish you, I said. I bought it because my mother deserved to walk into her kitchen without wondering whether the roof would hold. Because your name on a ledger shouldn't be the measure of our dignity. Because when you chose to step out of my day, I stepped into my life. How? He began low, a grunt of disbelief. You always believed money was power, I said softly, and for the first time I saw doubt bloom there. You were right. But you mistook wealth for dominance. I used what I had to build something for everyone, not to be owed to but to owe to others. My sister's hand found mine. Aunt Miriam's mouth pressed into a thin line. Some faces softened. Others remained marbles of consternation. He rose as if to speak, then paused, fingers tightening on the back of his chair. This isn't a spectacle, I continued, scanning the room that used to decide my worth in a glance. It's a choice. I choose generosity over grudges. I chose to be the keeper of what mattered. If you want to challenge that, we'll have to go through the facts, not the theatrics. He laughed then, a raw defensive sound, and the laugh carried the promise of a storm. He stepped away from the table, and the room leaned forward, waiting for whether he would retreat into silence or strike back. The night held its breath, and so did I, knowing the next move would change more than our tongues could. The church doors groaned open like a secret being told. Cold sunlight spilled across the aisle and caught on the little things I'd chosen with care. The ribbon at the pews, the worn hymnals my grandmother loved. And for a suspended second I was only a woman in a white dress, heart hammering like a drum, every head in the room measuring me the way my father had taught them to measure me. I could hear him before I saw him. The sharp intake, the rustle of a jacket, the way his silence cut the air. He sat with his back straight, the same posture that had made me small for 30 years. My brother's eyes darted. My mother looked everywhere but at me. I began to walk. Step by step the humiliation he'd handed me 3 weeks before folded into something wider. The organ breathed. Old faces leaned forward. Somewhere a relative whispered, "Isn't she?" and then stopped, because she wasn't what they'd rehearsed her to be. At the front, the minister's gaze found mine, and in that look there was permission. I had rehearsed this speech in 1,000 mirrors, but in the sacred hush it came out true and simpler than pride. You taught me the rules. When someone takes your moment, you make a larger one. I told them plainly that I had not depended on him. I told them the truth that had been my quiet fortress, the years of work that built a life he never acknowledged, the friends who mortgaged their trust to believe in me, the small stubborn savings that turned into the security that paid for this day. I watched their eyebrows climb like fences. My father blinked as if the ground under him might be new. My brother's jaw loosened. My mother's hands trembled. You made me invisible, I said, voice steady, and I decided I would stop shrinking to make you comfortable. There was no shout, no vindictive glee. Only a clarity that felt like light. Then, because I wanted the shape of power to change as well as the air, I handed him an envelope. I didn't expect him to open it. He did. Inside was a simple note. I had purchased the brownstone in his name, not as a mockery but as proof I could. The room shifted. Some nodded, some laughed nervously, some looked betrayed. My father looked at the ink as if it were a sentence. I had not sought revenge. I had remade the ledger. Silence gathered, thick and uncertain, and in that silence I felt the ripple begin. This wasn't the end of their questions, only the start of their reckoning. The weeks after the dinner became a careful kind of war planning. I pored over lists, not of insults but of names. The cousin who had been quietly borrowing my credit card for years. The friend who had once slept on my couch and later built a business I believed in. The woman from the non-profit whose nursing program I'd sponsored without anyone's applause. I called them one by one, and each call was a brick laid toward a new ceremony. "Will you stand with me?" I asked, and each answer came with a softness that steadied me. On the morning of the wedding, the church smelled of cedar and the wet cold of Brooklyn streets. Sunlight lanced through stained glass and painted my hands gold. My procession was not empty. It was a slow, deliberate reclaiming. The man I had helped fund through night classes, the niece whose medical bills I had quietly paid, the old friend my father had dismissed as a drain. They walked with me not because they were obligated, but because they had seen me show up for them when dignity required no audience. Their faces were steady. Their presence knit a different kind of lineage. When my father arrived, there was a hush like wind sucking the air from a room. He took his seat as if at the head of a table he no longer owned. Later, when I stood to speak, I did not cast stones. I spoke in facts, quiet, unavoidable facts. Mortgages settled, tuition covered. A small trust established for the mother he claimed to love but refused to support in public. The words were not triumphal. They were simple. For years, I said, I paid the bills you bragged about being able to pay. I fed the family you pretended to protect. The room shifted. Shame is always louder when reversed. Faces creased, murmurs rose, and my father's jaw worked like someone trying to remember a line he'd practiced and couldn't find. I felt pity and steel at once. Power had been redistributed, not through spectacle, but through the ledger of real life. I wasn't interested in ruining him. I wanted to reclaim my story. Afterwards, people came to me with tears, with apologies they hadn't voiced at the dinner table. Some left without a word. I looked at my hands that had built more than one life for others, and finally felt them belong to me. What is your deepest pain when it comes to family rejection? In that pause, with the room waiting and my father gathering himself to speak, everything still hung in the balance. The church bells still echo in my bones when I remember the way the doors opened that morning, not to reveal a gulf where my father should have been, but to reveal the line I had chosen for myself. I walked slow, the aisle broad as a promise, sunlight spilling through stained glass onto faces that had once measured me with thin eyes. At first there was a hush, then a shifting. Not all of it sympathy, some of it surprise. You could see the recalibration happen across the room, like a tide finally reaching the shore. My sister sat 2 rows back, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. My mother's face was a map of shame and relief. A cousin I had thought indifferent stood as if surprised to find himself on my side. My father remained in the crowd instead of at the front, his posture a study in small refusals. When I passed him, I didn't look away. I carried my dignity like a banner. Someone in the back sniffed, laughter that wasn't unkind, and the tension peeled away into something fiercer and truer. At the reception, after vows and 1,000 congratulations, I felt the room lean in and I spoke. I told them I had not walked away from family but toward truth. I told them about the nights I worked 2 jobs, about the loans I quietly took so Aunt Rosa could keep her apartment, about the years I was the silent guarantor of our household, the one who kept the lights on while judgments were passed. The revelation landed like a bell. The person they thought dispensable had been the backbone they never thanked. The air changed. Power, it turned out, had a surprising geometry. My father's face crumpled in a way I had not wanted to witness, but which I needed to see. Words stumbled from him. An apology thin as paper, a shame deeper than I expected. I did not take that apology as absolution. I took it as a beginning. The humiliation that had tried to define me was reframed by choices I had made for myself. Generosity without expectation, independence without spite, and a resilience that did not require his validation. When the night thinned and the lights went low, people left with new maps of who I had always been. I kept a quiet seat by the window, listening to the city breathe. I had been humiliated, yes, but I had turned the ledger. The power shift was not revenge. It was a redirection of worth. And now at this quiet hour I ask you, what is your deepest pain when it comes to family rejection?